August 1945, Okinawa, Japan. The air still smelled of smoke and scorched earth. The war had ended, yet the echoes of artillery and screams lingered in the minds of the survivors. In a makeshift camp outside the city, rows of Japanese women prisoners of war shuffled forward, hands trembling, eyes wide with caution. They had been through years of deprivation, rationed rice, bitter tea, and the relentless shadow of fear. Then a strange, unfamiliar aroma wafted through the barracks courtyard, hot, crispy, and savory. American soldiers, smiling but wary, carried trays stacked with fried chicken, golden and steaming, alongside bottles of Coca-Cola, their dark liquid fizzing in the sunlight. Silence fell, hesitation, disbelief. Some of the women whispered to each other, questioning whether such indulgence could be real or if it was another trick. Slowly, hands reached out, tentatively touching the crispy crust. Eyes widened, mouths opened. For a fleeting moment, the war, the hunger, and the terror seemed to vanish. This simple meal, fried chicken and a bottle of cola, was more than food. It was a shock, a revelation, and a bridge between captor and captive. Context. Background. Section 1. By August 1945, the Pacific War had left Japan in ruins. Cities were flattened by relentless bombing campaigns, and the nation's infrastructure had collapsed. Millions were displaced, and the food supply had dwindled to near nothingness. Malnutrition, disease, and exhaustion were constants in daily life. The Japanese military, desperate and fractured, had fought to the last, instilling in its civilians a mindset of unyielding sacrifice and suspicion toward foreigners. Into this devastated landscape came the Allied forces. American occupation units had moved swiftly, establishing control over strategic areas, including Okinawa. POW camps were set up to house captured soldiers and civilians, particularly women who had been caught in combat zones or rounded up from devastated towns. These camps were strictly regulated, yet they offered basic sustenance, medical care, and relative safety, though the Japanese women, raised on wartime propaganda, regarded every act of generosity with skepticism. For years, Japanese propaganda had painted Americans as cruel, merciless, and almost inhuman. Posters, radio broadcasts, and school lessons described the devils who would shoot without warning and enslave civilians. In Okinawa and other islands, rumors of mass suicides during the final stages of battle reinforced this fear. Many families had chosen death over surrender, jumping from cliffs or drowning themselves rather than face capture. Survival in such an environment was not just physical, it was psychological. When the war finally ended with Japan's surrender, the women POWs entered a world that was ostensibly safe, but completely foreign. The camp routines were structured and orderly. Prisoners were assigned barracks, provided minimal rations, and required to participate in labor and hygiene duties. Yet, despite the relative calm, anxiety remained high. The women had internalized years of fear. They expected cruelty, deprivation, and humiliation at every turn. Into this tense, wary atmosphere came an unexpected gesture, food that was unfamiliar, rich, and indulgent. For these women, the sight of fried chicken and bottles of Coca-Cola was jarring. In Japan, such items were rare, almost unimaginable luxuries. Sugar, meat, and processed beverages had been rationed to near nothingness. The women had grown accustomed to bland staples, rice, miso soup, small portions of vegetables, and occasional fish. To see the Americans serving fried chicken, golden and crispy, alongside the sweet fizzy cola, was a direct challenge to everything they had been taught about the enemy. The Americans, for their part, were acting according to orders and logistical practicality. Standard rations included canned goods and preserved items, but special shipments, whether for morale, psychological operations, or simply the novelty of sharing local comforts, were occasionally distributed. Meals such as fried chicken and soda were chosen deliberately to introduce a sense of normalcy and perhaps to humanize the occupying forces in the eyes of the prisoners. The women, however, could not immediately reconcile what they saw with their expectations. Some hesitated at the edge of the serving line, hesitant to accept something so lavish. Others glanced around nervously, searching for hidden threats. But the aroma, the sight of steaming food, and the clink of glass bottles were impossible to ignore. Slowly, curiosity began to replace fear. Fingers extended, hands grasped. A bite was taken. A sip of cola fizzed in the mouth. The world had shifted, if only slightly, for these women. This moment, simple yet profound, was rooted in a larger context of post-war occupation, cultural shock, and the human need for nourishment, both physical and emotional. The introduction of Western food into the camps was more than an act of sustenance. It was a collision of worlds. It revealed the stark contrasts between Japanese wartime austerity and American abundance, between fear-driven expectation and tangible generosity. The reaction of the prisoners would ripple through the camp in subtle but significant ways. Trust, initially fragile, began to form. Curiosity became engagement. Astonishment slowly gave way to tentative enjoyment. The scene of Japanese women cautiously savoring fried chicken and Coca-Cola would become emblematic of a broader human story, one in which small acts of kindness could pierce years of indoctrinated fear, even amid the ruins of war. Context, background, Section 2. The post-surrender period in Japan was defined by a pervasive hunger, not just the gnawing emptiness of the stomach, but a deep cultural and emotional deprivation. The war had stripped away normalcy, routine, and certainty. Entire cities lay in rubble, schools and hospitals were destroyed, and food shortages were catastrophic. For women in POW camps, survival had been an unrelenting test of endurance. Every meal, however meager, was approached with caution, rationed carefully, and consumed with gratitude, tinged by suspicion. When American soldiers began to distribute unfamiliar foods, items like fried chicken, Coca-Cola, canned fruits, and occasional sweets, the prisoners experienced an acute cultural dissonance. These foods were symbols of abundance and industrial efficiency, concepts foreign to women accustomed to near starvation. For many, the initial reaction was disbelief. Could this generosity be genuine? Was it safe to eat? Questions of trust intermingled with curiosity, creating a tension that hung over the camp like a silent fog. The soldiers themselves were acutely aware of these dynamics. Officers instructed their men to treat prisoners with dignity, provide sufficient rations, and maintain discipline without cruelty. Beyond duty, there was an understanding that small gestures could break down barriers built over years of propaganda. Meals such as fried chicken and Coca-Cola were carefully chosen for their symbolic and psychological impact. The golden fried chicken, aromatic and warm, contrasted starkly with the bland staples Japanese women had endured. The fizzy cola, sweet and effervescent, was a marvel to those who had only tasted watered-down tea or thin rice porridge for years. The women's previous experiences informed every bite. Some approached the food tentatively, observing the reactions of others before committing. Their hands trembled as they held the plates, glancing repeatedly at the soldiers serving them. Conversations were whispered, and laughter, rare and cautious, was muffled. Slowly, the familiarity of hunger gave way to recognition. They were not being harmed, nor mocked, nor deceived. The food was real. The generosity was real. This moment was more than a sensory awakening. It was a subtle reshaping of perception. Women who had been conditioned to fear, distrust, and even hate the occupiers were confronted with an undeniable act of kindness. The golden fried chicken and the dark fizzy cola were tangible proof that the Americans could be human, compassionate, and approachable. For many, It was their first encounter with a world beyond the narrow propagandized narrative they had grown up with. Furthermore, the act of sharing food had social implications within the camp. Prisoners who were initially withdrawn began to gather in small groups, discussing flavors, textures, and the novelty of the meal. Bonds formed over shared astonishment. Smiles appeared. A sense of community, fragile and delicate, began to re-emerge. In these simple interactions, the psychological walls erected by years of fear started to crumble, replaced by curiosity and cautious trust. From the perspective of American soldiers, these interactions were instructional as well. Observing the women's reactions provided insight into the deep psychological scars left by years of indoctrination and deprivation. It reinforced the importance of empathy, patience, and cultural sensitivity in post-war operations. Small gestures, meals, games, photographs, or conversation could bridge divides that conventional diplomacy or military orders could not. In essence, the distribution of fried chicken and Coca-Cola within the POW camp was emblematic of a larger post-war strategy, rebuilding trust through humanity, demonstrating abundance without arrogance, and establishing a new social order grounded in respect rather than fear. The women's astonishment was not merely about taste. It was about a confrontation with a reality they had been taught to deny, a tangible expression of care in a world they had expected only cruelty. By the end of the first week, the camp atmosphere had subtly shifted. Fear remained, but so did curiosity. Hunger persisted, but it was now tinged with a sense of possibility. The simple act of offering food had opened doors to human connection that words alone could never have achieved. Each bite of fried chicken, each sip of fizzy cola became a small victory over years of deprivation, distrust, and fear, a bridge toward understanding in the fragile dawn of peace. Angles, Section 1, Human and Psychological Angle. The women prisoners' reaction to fried chicken and Coca-Cola was deeply human. After years of starvation, deprivation, and fear, the appearance of rich, flavorful food was nothing short of shocking. Their hands shook as they reached for the plates. Eyes, once cautious and weary, widened in disbelief. Smells, textures, and tastes they had only imagined in passing dreams now assaulted their senses with an intensity that was almost overwhelming. For many, it was the first moment since capture that they could feel pleasure without fear. The juxtaposition of abundance against the backdrop of scarcity created a psychological tension that was palpable. It wasn't just about nourishment, it was about validation. These women had endured unimaginable hardship, huddled in cold barracks, subsisting on rice, miso, and occasional scraps. The simple act of being served food by their former enemies challenged every expectation they had internalized. Hesitation was visible in the line of prisoners. Some reached tentatively, glancing over shoulders for threats, while others stood frozen, staring at the trays as if the sight itself were unreal. The war had taught them that generosity from Americans could only be a precursor to harm. Yet the soldiers' calm demeanor, their measured smiles, and the orderly presentation of the meal slowly chipped away at that deeply ingrained suspicion. Years of wartime propaganda had painted Americans as merciless devils. Women had internalized images of violence and cruelty. Entire families had leapt from cliffs on Saipan and Okinawa rather than surrender. These memories lingered, forming an invisible psychological barrier even after the war's end. When the trays of fried chicken and bottles of Coca-Cola appeared, the women's minds raced between disbelief, fear, and curiosity. Could they trust these strangers? Was the food poisoned? As the first bites were taken, a remarkable transformation occurred. Relief replaced fear, even if only temporarily. Smiles began to appear, hesitant at first, then more freely. Murmurs of delight traveled across the camp. the taste of fried chicken, a combination of salt, fat, and spices, was completely alien to the prisoners. The fizzy sweetness of Coca-Cola seemed almost magical. Each bite, each sip, carried with it the weight of years of deprivation, a tangible proof that they were safe, cared for, and still capable of experiencing joy. The human brain, conditioned for caution and suspicion, slowly recalibrated in response to these sensory cues. Gratitude, once impossible to imagine, began to take root. This encounter was also a profound cultural moment. Food in Japan during wartime was utilitarian. Luxury items were rare, and sweets or fried foods were considered indulgences for the privileged few. For women who had survived months on minimal rations, the sight of golden fried chicken and effervescent soda was not merely a novelty, it was a cultural revelation. The sensory overload, smell, taste, color, even perceived in black and white imagination, and texture, challenged their assumptions about the occupiers, creating a moment of cognitive dissonance. Moreover, this simple act of feeding the prisoners had emotional resonance beyond the immediate satisfaction of hunger. It reminded them of pre-war normalcy, family meals, celebrations, and small pleasures now lost to history. In that brief window, they could remember what life had once been, and perhaps imagine what it could be again. The meal became a bridge between their past and the uncertain post-war present, a tactile reminder of humanity amidst chaos. The shared experience of the meal also facilitated social bonds among the women. Whispered observations, laughter, and cautious gestures created a subtle, emergent community. Seeing others accept and enjoy the food reinforced the notion that it was safe. Tentative gestures became confident ones. Shared astonishment became shared joy. In a camp defined by fear, monotony, and scarcity, the simple act of eating together became an anchor, a momentary reprieve that reaffirmed human connection. The human and psychological dimensions of this event illustrate the profound impact of small gestures in post-war recovery. Hunger, fear, and trauma collided with generosity, novelty, and care. In that moment, fried chicken and Coca-Cola were far more than sustenance. They were instruments of trust, catalysts for healing, and reminders that even in the aftermath of immense suffering, humanity could still find a way to connect. Angles, Section 2. Technological, Leadership, and Tactical Angle. Behind the seemingly simple act of serving fried chicken and Coca-Cola lay a complex web of logistical planning. The American military had to coordinate supply chains across oceans, ensuring that perishable items reached the camps safely. Refrigeration units, often powered by portable generators, maintained the frozen state of chicken and the carbonation of sodas. Cans and bottles were carefully handled to prevent spoilage or breakage. In a war-torn region where local infrastructure was devastated, this feat was not trivial. It was a demonstration of the technological and organizational superiority of the occupying forces. The very ability to provide such indulgences highlighted the disparity between the resources available to the Americans and the scarcity endured by Japanese civilians. For the prisoners, the fried chicken and fizzy soda were more than a meal. They were tangible evidence of a world built on industrial efficiency and logistical mastery. Every bottle of Coke, every piece of perfectly fried chicken was a small triumph of supply chain engineering, refrigeration technology, and wartime planning. This technological prowess, even when serving something as simple as a snack, underscored the Americans' ability to mobilize resources on a scale unimaginable to those who had lived under blockade and rationing. The distribution of such meals was not merely an operational convenience, it was a carefully considered leadership decision. Officers recognized that morale and psychological well-being were essential components of post-conflict governance. By allowing soldiers to share indulgent foods with prisoners, Commanders sought to achieve multiple objectives: reduce fear, encourage cooperation, and demonstrate humane treatment in accordance with the Geneva Conventions. This approach required foresight and empathy. Leaders understood the psychological scars left by years of indoctrination, propaganda, and deprivation. They recognized that small, symbolic gestures could achieve what coercion could not. Fried chicken and Coca-Cola became tools of soft power, subtly shifting perceptions of the occupying forces. For the women, these acts challenged ingrained assumptions about the enemy and created openings for trust, dialogue, and adaptation to post-war realities. Leadership in this context was exercised not with weapons or orders, but with the strategic distribution of kindness. Providing indulgent meals was also a tactical decision. In a post-conflict environment, stability depended on minimizing unrest, preventing disease, and maintaining order within the camps. Proper nutrition played a direct role in achieving these objectives. By offering more than the bare minimum, the Americans reduced the likelihood of disputes over rations and fostered a sense of routine and normalcy. The tactical impact was immediate and observable. The women, initially wary, began to form orderly lines, follow instructions, and cooperate with camp routines. Shared meals reduced tension and mitigated potential conflicts. Even minor disruptions, such as food spills or arguments over portions, were handled within a context of mutual respect rather than punishment. This approach illustrates the intersection of strategy, psychology, and logistics. Feeding prisoners well was not simply humane, it was pragmatic, ensuring smoother operations and a safer environment for both prisoners and soldiers. Fried chicken and Coca-Cola also served as cultural mediators. They provided a bridge between the familiar and the foreign, allowing the women to engage with an entirely different worldview. The choice of food, carefully considered by leadership, offered both novelty and comfort. It demonstrated abundance without ostentation, reinforcing the narrative that the Americans were capable, organized, and benevolent. This strategy, blending technology, leadership, and tactical acumen, proved highly effective. It turned a simple meal into an instrument of influence, a tool for social cohesion, and a mechanism for psychological rehabilitation. The women's astonishment and cautious enjoyment became markers of a subtle transformation, one in which fear began to give way to curiosity, and suspicion gradually shifted toward trust. The long-term significance of such measures extended beyond the immediate camp environment. By demonstrating care, efficiency, and empathy, the American forces laid the groundwork for broader post-war reconciliation. These gestures, though small in isolation, contributed to the larger process of humanizing the enemy, bridging cultural divides, and rebuilding trust in a devastated society. The strategic use of food, technologically preserved, thoughtfully distributed, and psychologically impactful, illustrates how attention to detail, leadership foresight, and tactical consideration can shape human behavior and influence post-conflict recovery. In this convergence of technology, leadership, and tactical planning, fried chicken and Coca-Cola became far more than food. They were symbols of a new order, instruments of psychological repair, and tangible reminders that even in the aftermath of immense suffering, structured kindness could sow the seeds of trust, cooperation, and humanity. Climax. Turning Point. Section 1. The turning point in the story of Japanese women POWs came not in a battle, nor in a grand strategic maneuver, but in the quiet, charged atmosphere of the camp dining area. For months, these women had lived in a state of fear, deprivation, and near starvation. Every day was measured by the scarce rations they received: thin rice porridge, occasional vegetables, and meager scraps of protein. Their trust in the occupiers was tenuous at best, fragile from years of indoctrination and wartime trauma. Yet on this particular day, the air was thick with a new kind of tension, anticipation. American soldiers, aware of the psychological significance of their gesture, moved deliberately, carrying trays of fried chicken, steaming hot from makeshift camp kitchens, alongside bottles of Coca-Cola, chilled to perfection in portable ice boxes. The scent of frying meat and sweet, fizzy soda immediately drew attention. Eyes widened, some women froze in place, while others edged closer, curiosity tempered by caution. It was a moment of uncertainty. Could this abundance be trusted? One by one, the women approached the line, their hands shaking slightly as they accepted the plates. The first bites were tentative, a cautious taste of something unfamiliar, yet undeniably satisfying. The golden crunch of the chicken, the warm, savory aroma, the tang of spices, they collided with every memory of scarcity, hunger, and survival. The Coca-Cola, with its sweet effervescence, sparked astonishment and wonder. For many, it was an entirely new sensation, something so pleasurable, so indulgent, that it felt almost impossible. The camp's atmosphere shifted palpably. Whispered exclamations of delight and disbelief traveled across the barracks. The women began to exchange glances, silently communicating astonishment and curiosity. Some laughed quietly, a sound rare and almost forbidden in the months of confinement. Others closed their eyes as they savored the flavors, a private communion with the senses long denied. In that moment, the war, its fear, its cruelty, its relentless deprivation, felt, for a few fleeting minutes, suspended. The soldiers, trained in both logistics and human psychology, observed carefully. They noted the gradual transformation in the prisoners' demeanor. Faces that had been etched with anxiety softened. Shoulders that had been tense relaxed. The silent fear that had permeated the camp began to crack, replaced with cautious engagement. Each bite of fried chicken, each sip of Coca-Cola acted as a small but potent instrument of trust, reinforcing the possibility that generosity from the occupiers was genuine. The climax of this turning point was not a single dramatic gesture, but a collective awakening. A group of 5 women who had remained hesitant at the back of the line finally stepped forward together. Their hands clasped the plates firmly, but their eyes reflected wonder rather than fear. As they tasted the food, their whispered conversations grew more animated, laughter more confident. This small act, shared indulgence in simple, delicious food, was emblematic of a larger transformation, the breaking down of fear through human kindness. The psychological stakes were immense. These women had been conditioned to expect cruelty, betrayal, and hardship at every turn. The sudden presence of abundance, delivered with respect and calm, forced a reevaluation of everything they had been taught. The simple act of receiving fried chicken and Coca-Cola challenged deeply ingrained narratives, undermining years of fear-based conditioning. It was a turning point in trust, perception, and emotional recovery. Beyond the immediate psychological impact, this moment also carried symbolic weight. The food represented a tangible demonstration of victory, not through violence, but through care. The Americans' ability to provide abundance in the midst of post-war scarcity was a quiet assertion of stability and power. For the women, the realization that their captors could act with generosity, patience, and foresight altered the very structure of their mental and emotional landscape. The soldiers themselves recognized the significance. They understood that such gestures, though small, could ripple through the camp, influencing behavior, morale, and social cohesion. By choosing not to force compliance through authority or intimidation, but to invite cooperation through generosity, they transformed the camp into a space where fear gradually gave way to curiosity, observation, and ultimately, cautious trust. As the meal continued, the first cracks of laughter and conversation spread. The atmosphere in the dining area shifted from tense vigilance to tentative engagement. For the first time in months, the women were not merely surviving, they were experiencing something akin to normalcy. The sensory pleasure of fried chicken and Coca-Cola became inseparable from the broader human realization. Safety and kindness were possible. The turning point was complete when the last of the 5 hesitant women finished their meal and joined the conversation, smiles evident, eyes brightened with cautious optimism. In this moment, the power of simple gestures was laid bare. The turning point was not the arrival of food alone, it was the combination of abundance, care, and respect that allowed these women to experience a small but profound shift in their perception of the occupiers. Hunger had been temporarily satiated, fear had been momentarily suspended, and the first seeds of trust had been planted. Climax, Turning Point, Section 2. The transformation did not end with the first meal. Over the next several days, the Americans maintained a deliberate rhythm of generosity. Fried chicken and Coca-Cola were served at scheduled intervals, each event carefully orchestrated to reinforce trust, routine, and psychological stability. For the Japanese women, these repeated experiences became milestones in a slow, almost imperceptible shift from fear to cautious engagement. Each meal was a lesson in reliability. The enemy could be consistent, generous, and humane. Observers noted the changes immediately. The once silent barracks began to hum with muted conversation. Women who had avoided eye contact now exchanged glances and comments. The 5 women who had first stepped forward tentatively became informal leaders within the camp, modeling curiosity and cautious enjoyment for others. Their reactions spread through the ranks, creating a subtle ripple effect. More prisoners came forward, more questions were asked, and laughter, soft but genuine, punctuated the once oppressive atmosphere. The soldiers themselves played an active role in this transition. They engaged with the women not as captors, but as facilitators of these moments of normalcy. Plates were handed with care, smiles were offered, and patience was exercised when initial hesitations arose. In these interactions, leadership and empathy merged. The American forces understood that authority alone could not achieve this transformation. It required a measured blend of consistency, respect, and small acts of kindness. The technical precision of the logistics, maintaining food quality, timing distribution, and preserving beverages, combined seamlessly with human understanding to achieve a profound psychological outcome. This period also exposed the prisoners to new cultural experiences. Fried chicken, unlike anything they had eaten before, was seasoned in unfamiliar ways, while the fizzy sweetness of Coca-Cola represented a novelty of flavor and sensation. The women's reactions were a mixture of surprise, delight, and incredulity. Many laughed in disbelief, others studied the textures and tastes with intense concentration. These reactions were more than curiosity. They were the first instances in which the prisoners allowed themselves to experience pleasure without guilt or fear. The simple act of eating became an act of liberation. In one particularly poignant moment, a small group of women gathered around a makeshift table, sharing slices of fried chicken and sipping Coke from bottles, their laughter rising above the usual camp noise. They began to photograph these moments, using cameras occasionally provided to them, preserving evidence of their astonishment and enjoyment. These images would later serve as historical documentation of an extraordinary human experience, proof that kindness, delivered thoughtfully, could pierce the armor of indoctrination and trauma. The turning point also carried symbolic resonance for the soldiers. They witnessed firsthand how deliberate acts of care could reshape perceptions, soften hardened mentalities, and build bridges where suspicion and fear had long dominated. It was an affirmation of strategy that relied not on coercion, but on the humanizing power of generosity. Each plate of fried chicken and bottle of Coca-Cola was a tactical instrument as much as it was a simple meal, an embodiment of soft power, operational foresight, and psychological insight. By the end of this period, the camp's social dynamic had shifted. Fear remained, of course, but it was no longer absolute. Curiosity and tentative trust began to coexist alongside caution. The women were engaging more openly with their environment and with the soldiers, participating in discussions, and even helping to maintain order in the dining areas. What had begun as an extraordinary gesture of food provision had blossomed into a subtle yet powerful cultural exchange, laying the groundwork for future reconciliation. The culmination of this turning point was marked by an informal, communal meal. All prisoners were invited to partake without hesitation, and for the first time there was no visible tension. Women moved freely, shared stories, and smiled openly as they tasted the fried chicken and Coca-Cola. It was a moment that encapsulated the entire strategy. Abundance, empathy, and consistency had converged to achieve a psychological victory more enduring than any battlefield triumph. This period also demonstrated the broader implications of well-executed post-conflict management. The Americans' attention to detail, ensuring quality, maintaining schedules, and interacting respectfully, highlighted how logistical expertise and human empathy could be combined to rebuild fractured trust. The women's astonishment was not merely about the food, it was a profound acknowledgement that the world could contain both power and kindness simultaneously. As the days progressed, this turning point solidified into routine expectation. Fried chicken and Coca-Cola became symbols of reliability, comfort, and humanity. The camp, once a place defined by fear, deprivation, and indoctrination, had been subtly transformed into an environment where emotional recovery could begin, one meal at a time. In these small gestures lay a profound truth. Even in the aftermath of war, carefully orchestrated acts of care could reshape perceptions, mend psychological wounds, and illuminate the path toward trust and reconciliation. Aftermath, Section 1. The days and weeks following the introduction of fried chicken and Coca-Cola brought measurable changes to the Japanese women POWs. Their physical health, long compromised by malnutrition, began to improve subtly. The protein-rich meals and sugary beverages provided not only immediate caloric replenishment, but also a psychological boost that had tangible effects on appetite, energy, and mood. Women who had previously struggled to rise from their bunks now moved with steadier steps, their faces losing some of the gaunt tension that had defined life in the camp. Beyond the physical, the emotional and psychological aftermath was profound. For months, fear had dominated every interaction, every glance, every decision. Indoctrination and wartime propaganda had ingrained a persistent expectation of cruelty. The unexpected acts of generosity disrupted these conditioned responses. Women began to approach the soldiers with curiosity instead of suspicion, asking questions, observing quietly, and engaging in limited but meaningful exchanges. Small gestures, a smile, a nod of recognition, a polite inquiry, became normalized in ways that would have been unthinkable only weeks prior. The camp's social hierarchy also shifted. The women who had first embraced the food offerings became informal leaders and mediators. Their visible enjoyment and willingness to engage with the soldiers set an example for others, encouraging hesitant prisoners to step forward. This created a subtle, cascading effect. Cooperation replaced avoidance, trust replaced fear, and shared meals became a ritual of communal reassurance. Even the most skeptical prisoners began to recognize that the Americans' gestures were not fleeting tricks, but part of a deliberate, sustained effort to ensure humane treatment. Official reports from the camp recorded these shifts. Medical officers noted improvements in weight, and vitality, while behavioral observations highlighted reduced anxiety and increased social cohesion. Prisoners, previously withdrawn and silent, began to interact more, sharing personal anecdotes, small acts of kindness, and even laughter. The combination of physical nourishment and psychological reassurance created a feedback loop. Improved health reinforced emotional stability, and emotional stability reinforced willingness to accept aid. The broader impact of these changes extended beyond the immediate prisoners. Camp operations became smoother. Soldiers observed fewer incidents of conflict, confusion, or unrest. The atmosphere, once dominated by tension and mistrust, softened into one of cautious engagement and collaboration. Routines that had previously been governed by fear now included voluntary participation in communal meals, assistance with cleanup, and organized recreational activities. The food had become more than sustenance. It was a catalyst for order, cooperation, and social rebuilding. The significance of the aftermath extended into cultural understanding. These Japanese women, conditioned to view Americans as brutal occupiers, were now witnessing kindness, respect, and patience firsthand. It challenged deeply ingrained narratives and planted seeds of reconsideration. The acts of generosity were small, but their cumulative effect was transformative. They were learning, perhaps for the first time, that human behavior existed on a spectrum and that trust could coexist alongside authority. By the end of the first month following the introduction of these meals, observers noted that the prisoners' fear-driven reactions had largely diminished. While caution remained, a reasonable response to captivity, the pervasive anxiety that had defined the early days of internment had been replaced by measured curiosity and adaptive engagement. This transformation illustrated the power of consistent, empathetic action in altering not just individual behavior, but the collective atmosphere of a confined population. The after effects of this turning point extended beyond simple gratitude for meals. They represented a microcosm of post-conflict rehabilitation, a tangible demonstration that careful attention to psychological, nutritional, and social needs could yield extraordinary results. Aftermath. Section 2. As the weeks turned into months, the long-term effects of these acts of care became unmistakable. The Japanese women POWs began to display resilience, previously unseen in the camp. Their daily routines, once mechanical and perfunctory, now included moments of engagement and small pleasures. The ritual of receiving fried chicken and Coca-Cola had evolved from novelty to a symbol of stability. It provided a predictable structure in an otherwise uncertain world, a psychological anchor that reassured prisoners that the outside world had not entirely abandoned them. Medical staff and camp administrators reported measurable improvements. Cases of depression, fatigue, and malnutrition declined significantly. Prisoners exhibited stronger immune responses and greater alertness, which in turn reduced minor illnesses and injuries caused by weakness or inattentiveness. The women, previously prone to silent despair, began participating in camp activities and communal tasks with energy and attention. Their willingness to contribute positively impacted overall camp functioning, creating a cooperative environment that eased the burden on soldiers and staff alike. Equally significant was the shift in morale and social dynamics. The initial shock of generosity had sparked curiosity. Over time, it fostered communication and camaraderie. Women who had previously avoided contact now shared stories, helped one another, and engaged with soldiers in small conversations. Even minor cultural exchanges, sharing preferences, comparing familiar foods, or discussing flavors, became moments of trust-building. These interactions, although simple, dismantled the psychological walls of indoctrination that had long isolated the prisoners from the soldiers. The transformation extended to the soldiers as well. Witnessing the profound effect of these deliberate, humane actions reinforced the value of empathy and attention to human needs. The strategy, initially conceived to improve morale and compliance, proved to be an exercise in psychological insight. The Americans had inadvertently demonstrated a universal truth: acts of care, when executed thoughtfully and consistently, could bridge cultural divides and dismantle fear even in the aftermath of a brutal war. A particularly striking outcome was the prisoners' willingness to document these experiences. Cameras, previously viewed as instruments of propaganda or surveillance, became tools of personal record. Women photographed meals, interactions, and moments of shared laughter. These images served not only as personal mementos, but also as historical evidence of a remarkable reversal. Prisoners, conditioned to expect cruelty, now documented kindness and generosity. The visual record became a testament to the power of small, deliberate actions in transforming perceptions and fostering trust. By the time the camp neared the end of its operation, the psychological shift was clear. Fear had not disappeared entirely. It remained a shadow, a product of months of indoctrination and wartime trauma, but it no longer dominated daily life. The women exhibited autonomy, agency, and cautious optimism. They approached interactions with discernment rather than dread, engaged in communal activities, and accepted acts of kindness without suspicion. The combination of physical nourishment and emotional reinforcement had created a new equilibrium. The aftermath also left a lasting legacy for military strategy and humanitarian practice. The Americans' attention to detail, maintaining food quality, scheduling meals, and demonstrating consistent respect, highlighted a broader lesson: logistical precision, when combined with empathy, could achieve outcomes beyond immediate compliance. Psychological rehabilitation, cultural understanding, and operational efficiency were intertwined, and the lessons learned in this small POW camp would inform future practices in post-conflict management and humanitarian operations. Ultimately, the aftermath of these simple meals revealed a profound truth. Even in environments defined by deprivation, fear, and conflict, deliberate acts of care could catalyze recovery, resilience, and reconciliation. The fried chicken and Coca-Cola were more than nourishment. They were instruments of psychological transformation, social reconstruction, and cultural bridge building. Reflection, closure. The story of Japanese women POWs, once trapped in fear and deprivation, finding astonishment and comfort in fried chicken and Coca-Cola, is more than a curious anecdote. It is a testament to the enduring power of human empathy. In a world torn by conflict, where suspicion and propaganda had shaped every thought and interaction, small acts of generosity became instruments of transformation. These meals were not merely food, they were symbols of stability, kindness, and the possibility of trust in the aftermath of devastation. History often remembers battles, strategies, and the movements of armies, yet it is within these intimate human moments that the deepest lessons emerge. The Americans' deliberate approach, combining logistical precision with empathetic engagement, demonstrated that authority and compassion could coexist. By providing nourishment consistently, engaging respectfully, and fostering moments of normalcy, they bridged a psychological chasm that seemed insurmountable. Fear gave way to cautious curiosity, suspicion softened into measured trust, and prisoners rediscovered the capacity for simple joy. The photographs, the laughter, and the shared meals became more than fleeting experiences. They were tangible markers of resilience. For the women, these moments offered a glimpse of autonomy and agency, a reprieve from years of indoctrination and deprivation. For the soldiers, the experience was a reminder that the influence of humanity could be as profound as any military tactic. In these interactions, the lines between captor and captive blurred, revealing a shared recognition of dignity and the transformative potential of empathy. In a broader historical context, these events illuminate the power of soft interventions in post-conflict recovery. They underscore the capacity for ordinary acts, meals, beverages, attention to well-being, to produce extraordinary outcomes. The lessons extend beyond POW camps, resonating in humanitarian aid, post-war reconstruction, and reconciliation efforts worldwide. Ultimately, the astonishment of these Japanese women at fried chicken and Coca-Cola is a quiet but powerful reminder. Even amid war, even after years of fear and suffering, human kindness can pierce the deepest barriers. In the simple joy of a meal, history whispers its most enduring truth, that care, consistency, and compassion remain among the most potent forces in the reconstruction of both hearts and societies.